Thank you for joining us for the next hour or two in this episode of Inside Myanmar podcast. In an age of nearly limitless content, we appreciate that you're choosing to take valuable time out of your day to learn more about what is happening in Myanmar. It's vital for this story to be heard by people around the world, and that starts right now with you. Welcome to this episode of Insight Myanmar podcast. We are recording from Bangkok, and I am really happy to be here with our guest, Lorcan Lovett, who will describe his many years of covering living in Myanmar, as well as post-coup work that he's done. So, Lorcan, thanks for joining us here. And can you tell us a bit about your background?
Hi, Joe. Yeah, sure. So it's great to be here. And my background is in journalism. So I started off about 12 years ago in the UK, where I'm from. I'm from South Wales. And then I spent a few years working for local newspapers there. After that, I moved to Vietnam. I spent a couple of years there. But it was Myanmar that was always a real source of intrigue for me, especially in Vietnam when I was a bit closer to the country, learning some more about it. So in 2017, February, I moved to Myanmar. Actually, it was, if you remember, U Ko was assassinated outside Yangon airport when he was cradling his grandson. So that happened on the 29th of January, which was my birthday. And it happened that I moved to Myanmar a few days after that. And then I joined the Irrawaddy for not so long, but maybe about 6 or 7 months. And that was a crash course into Burmese politics and news and dynamics. And then after that, I continued to live in Yangon until a few months after the coup. Freelancing and working for magazines and editing and things like that. And then I think it was April the 8th, 2021, I left.
So you arrived really when the transition was in its full blossom, and this is a really interesting and dynamic time to be in Yangon. You're in newsrooms from one place to the other. Events are happening every week, every month. There's a whole host of things happening during that time that we continue to talk about now. So before we talk about the coup and the post-coup reality, can you share what it was like being a journalist who was living and reporting both the features of the journalistic world as well as how that then intersected with the politics and everything else?
Yeah, I felt very lucky, and especially in hindsight, feel lucky to have been in Myanmar during that time. There was a real dynamic energy, and things were starting for the first time. There were a lot of kind of growing industries and new trends, and it had a really good energy about the place. So during that time, I got to travel across the country a bit on stories from, for instance, the new surf scene in Myanmar. People were surfing in Nui Song. And I got to go to Mogok, which was the land of rubies, and around Kachin State, and learn a little bit about the ethnic landscape and lesser known minorities like the Shan. And yeah, there was this kind of energy which was really motivating. So every day I felt very excited, right, to be in Myanmar. who am I going to meet that day? Yeah, what am I going to stumble upon? What stories will I find? What can I look into? And yeah, it was a really exciting time.
What kind of challenges did you face?
I think it was unfamiliar terrain for many people during that time. So when Myanmar was opening up like that, there was always going to be a time that both parties would need to invest in trying to understand each other a bit and what the kind of agenda was, what the goals were, and yeah, but not I don't know, not too many challenges. Maybe some will come back to me, but you know, there was I think about 2019 or 20. I felt like there was space in Yangon and in Myanmar for a new news and lifestyle publication, which could try to capture some of the energy that was happening, especially among the younger generation who were exposed to foreigners more and more and trying to absorb different cultures. So around that time, we started a website called Myanmar Mix, which I designed as a platform for young Burmese writers and photographers and even cartoonists to give them more of a voice and allow to kind of shape what the conversations were going on around Myanmar that time. So I didn't see so much challenges as just kind of like exciting things to engage with.
What was there challenges in Burmese newsrooms about some of the more controversial topics and how those might be covered or not be covered even?
Oh yeah, well, if we go back to 2017, of course, that was the Rohingya crisis, and I think it's pretty well known that that was a very difficult topic to discuss between foreigners and Myanmar people. Not all Myanmar, and also not all foreigners. Obviously, there's always going to be a mix of opinion on both sides. But I guess in the media realm, there was some tensions in our newsroom at the time in 2017, and probably in others, about how to report what was going on in Rakhine during that time, because you're dealing with, on one hand, foreigners who come from Western countries that have a very different perception of how media in a democracy should work when it comes to especially some minorities being persecuted. So yeah, that was a clear challenge in 2017 for sure.
So then you go and set up Myanmar Mix, and obviously by this time, several years, you're feeling that the environment that you're in, Yangon, the people you're meeting, the community, that something about that is not being represented to its full extent in the different media options that are out there. And I'm sure that's what went into why you wanted to create something like Myanmar Mix, to give that kind of representation and color and feeling. So what could you put your finger on that you were experiencing that you felt wasn't really, the media that was out there was not representing it, and there was this gap which led to the formation of Myanmar Mix?
Well, the first thing that springs to my mind is like humor. There was so much like funny things going on. And I felt like there was space for this online kind of digital entity that could reflect some of the absurdities and the funniness that was going on, and where people could be like a little bit silly as well, right? A place where both Myanmar and foreigners could kind of let their hair down a bit and not be so self-conscious or not be so serious, because Myanmar is a serious country, right? When you look at all of the difficult histories of what's happened, and all of those serious issues have to be discussed, but there's also space for something which is a slightly more lighthearted, while also taking into account that like these things can't be ignored. So, you know, we would do like beer testing, for instance, like all of the typical Myanmar supermarket beers, and do like a very serious but tongue-in-cheek review of those. We would have a lot of young Myanmar who would come on and write articles about like the histories of Myanmar swear words and just, kind of culturally interesting things. But, and also with like things like cinema listings and things that could be useful for people living there as well.
What kind of reception did you get with the work that you did?
I think we got a good reception. I felt like my instinct was right for that demand for that kind of thing, because people were engaging with us a lot. We were consistent during that time, constantly posting articles. As you know, you have to be consistent to grow an audience. And so that was going well. And then with time, it became a bit more successful. And we decided then that it was going to be time to launch like a very modest membership program to give it the longevity that it needed. I come from a journalism background, but at that time I was talking more with other businesses and trying to look for a path ahead to grow that as a business, because I didn't want it to become an entity that was applying and relying on grants. I wanted it to become part of this dynamic, exciting economy that was growing, and to be engaging with other businesses and grow it that way. So,
and how then, if you weren't going for the grant model and you were starting out, so it wasn't yet a business until it reached a certain point, how did it get funding to get off the ground in the first place?
I put all my money into it. It wasn't a huge amount, but I didn't have a huge amount of money either. But I thought, why not? Because it motivates me. So, and also I believed that it would work as well.
I liked what you said about it when we talked a few days ago. That you had a line that was something like your investment in Myanmar Mix was basically your investment in the growth and the belief of Myanmar. Did I get that right?
Yeah. And again, everything was going to plan, it was reaffirming my belief in the growth of Myanmar and the openness of the people there and the excitement of it all. Yeah, it was what I was expecting to happen until the big event.
This is before we get to that big event, this is also just for those who have listened to this podcast or those who have their own Myanmar experiences. This is fitting into one of those templates that we've heard so many other stories of, I was doing, the transition happened and I was building this and I was doing this and this was the response to it and this is how everyone was coming together and we were really believing in this project and how it was then benefiting Myanmar and Myanmar was coming into this. And then you have February 1st, 2021 and we have the darkness and the curtain falling. So take it from there.
Well, I will just mention as well, in the build up to that, we had such a great team, and I'm going to be cautious about naming people on this podcast because you never know, especially these days in Myanmar, who you might accidentally get into trouble or whatever. But we had such a great small team of writers, young girls and young boys working on Myanmar Mix, and it wouldn't have been possible to do without their contributions and their energy and creativity. And my partner at the time, who took care of all the tech side, and there's a great IT tech company in Myanmar. Again, I won't mention their name just in case, but they really helped us during that time as well. So I envisaged it as a stepping stone for first-time media workers so that they could build up a little portfolio there and then go on to work for someone bigger. And that did happen even in that short space of time. We had people who started there and then contributed to a big international outlets. Wow. And so that, again, it was really like rewarding and fulfilling. But then the big event came. So on the lead up to that, it was literally, we'd planned this membership program. It would just be a few dollars a month, just so that we could cover our costs. And then we would talk to local businesses to make sure that if you're a member, you could have a shot at winning, 2 days on the beach or some kind of prize in Yangon or a free pizza, anything, right? So we set up the page and everything. We didn't go live with it. And then all these rumors started. Is there going to be a coup? Are the military going to seize power? We don't know. And I think a few days before, the military said that they they were and then they weren't. And then it was that weekend, I think, where it's like, oh, they're probably not going to do it. So we were all good to go, and we were ready. And then, of course, I got a text message quite early in the morning on the day of the coup, the 1st of February, to say that they'd seized power. And within a few days, I think it became clear that any plans that I had and everybody else had there were totally transformed.
Yeah. So from a business point of view and a media operation, this of course changes everything within a matter of seconds, everything that you were building for. And so if you could briefly tell where Myanmar Mix is at now, and then go into your personal story of how you ended up pivoting to what direction you wanted to go in when the big event happened.
Yeah, so during that time into the coup, I kept Myanmar Mix going for at least a few months, I think, just to cover what was happening with the protests. While I was still trying to figure out, okay, what does the future look like? But also, we were out every day in the protests as well. I was covering like what was going on there, trying to cover my best about all of the elements of it. That was at the beginning of the idea of a federal army, a post-coup federal army, because that idea it's not new. But after the coup, when the security forces subjected the peaceful protesters to violence, I was training in a MMA gym in the early morning in Kendauji Lake in Yangon, and the guys there were like, "Hey, we can't take this from the police and the soldiers. We have to stand up for ourselves." And then I saw the beginning of what was becoming the PDF, right? So yeah, all of these things were happening. I would come home. I was also freelancing at that time as well, and trying to cover the protests. Not just for Myanmar Mix, but for an international audience. And it was difficult because you're so busy in the daytime to think about the bigger picture. But especially when it became apparent that the military weren't backing down and were sticking to the coup, despite the huge protests, it started to sink in for some people. This is going to be a horrendously bloody struggle for years to come, right? Even though it was quite a festive atmosphere in Yangon at the time, the seriousness of the situation started to sink in.
Did you feel that was a seriousness that was pervading everyone and all groups everywhere, or was it something that among certain people, certain informed people with institutional history like yourself as a journalist, that you had this sense of foreboding that it was coming?
I don't think that it was a kind of blanket acceptance that it was going to escalate into a nationwide uprising and so many deaths and all of that. I think that it was just among some people Myanmar people who knew the history. Well, they've had first-hand experience of the military. Yeah. They understood who they were dealing with. These were middle-aged parents who were telling their children, "You're not going out on the streets anymore," because they understood that where this was heading. Mm-hmm. A lot of younger people at that time in the protests, it was a weirdly fun time, in the protests, where people were holding like meme signs, and there was a lot of jokes and banter against Min Aung Hlaing, and the bodybuilders would do their own march, and but there was definitely this undercurrent of kind of foreboding sense of doom and darkness among especially the older Myanmar generation, who knew what was coming down the line.
Right, and then when those terrible crackdowns did happen, where were you at the time, and what was your involvement?
So I was covering the protests at the time, and given what I'd read about the previous uprisings, so like the Saffron Revolution and the 88 uprising and all of those other kind of outbursts of violence by the military, especially around the streets of Yangon. Initially, I didn't go straight into the middle of the protest. I'd find like an empty building, I'd go onto the 6th floor, and then I would just look to see what was happening, right? Because I didn't want to be like the person at the front who was shot. There's a lot of journalists who are a lot braver than I am, and especially photographers who are out taking photos. But after a while, I thought, oh, maybe they're not actually going to shoot, because it did take it took a little while. So then I started to get like among the protests a bit more, and there was this moment actually, maybe on the 6th or 7th of February, where they'd cut off the internet. The military cut off the internet, and I was around Sule Pagoda, and there was a huge protest marching towards Sule Pagoda, and we'd heard like rumors of it, but it was hard to verify anything. So I jumped on my bicycle and I cycled towards her, and we saw it. We saw like tens of thousands of people marching towards Sule, and I was like, oh my God, what is going to happen now? Are these people going to get mowed down by the soldiers? How can I tell people about this when there's no internet? So I phoned, I was able to make phone calls to local numbers at the time. So I phoned a friend whose girlfriend worked in an embassy, and she had access to the internet. And so over the phone, I was describing the scene to him. He told his girlfriend, and she was telling the Guardian. And so we were doing like a live blog of it through that, like saying, hey, this is it. People aren't accepting the coup. This is the first realization of this huge protest. And from here, there's like no going back. So yeah, we were out on the streets at that time. And then they started to shoot and kill some protesters. So things got a bit sketchier. Then I would go out, and suddenly instead of being tens of thousands, it was down to a few dozen protesters who would quickly run away, and then the police would, I wasn't shot at with real bullets at the time where I was in downtown, but it was happening. We could hear it happening around Yangon. And then from there, those same middle-aged parents who'd seen it all, I'm pretty sure they were like, hey, you're not leaving the house, to their children after that.
Mm-hmm. Were you at any protest where you saw personally any of the crackdowns happening?
Yeah, around downtown, we saw some people getting caught by the police, getting bloodied and beat up and taken away. We saw the stun grenades, and they were shooting towards. I was part of like a small group where they would shoot towards us like that, and we'd all kind of run in different directions.
And did you, when you witnessed the violence and the crackdowns, what did you see of the crowd response and the people that were on the streets as that was happening?
I sensed that the initial reaction naturally was panic and run, and then quickly after that there was a sense of like defiance and resilience. So people then started to make shields and helmets. They got slingshots out. They even filled up packets of chili sauce. They started to make improvised like tracks on the roads, dig in nails on the roads to stop vehicles. So it was very quick, like okay, let's do some active defense here. The streets were blocked. The paving stones were ripped up. The rubbish bins were pushed into the middle of the streets. My own street, there was a kind of blockade on either side. Community watch groups used to get together and then patrol the areas, because there was so much confusion at the time. Suu Kyi's been released. Oh, no, she's not being released. Oh, they've released these prisoners. Oh, no, they haven't released the prisoners. Someone like you don't know from your neighborhood, right? Suddenly your neighbors are grabbing that person, shaving off their eyebrows because they think they're a criminal. It was a really confusing time for everybody. Funnily enough, during that time, I was reading Outrage by Bertolt Lintner about the 88 uprising, and it was so uncanny to see his description of the aftermath of those protests and the military's response and what was happening in real time. I could read a few pages ahead, and no exaggeration, like that thing would happen, like the prisoner release, you know.
The same thing happened to me. I interviewed Matida, and I was reading her book Prisoner of Conscience about 1988, and as I was reading it, I was also following the news and doing interviews about the current events that was happening post 2021, And there were times when I was caught in her book that I confused what I was reading with the news I was following and other people I was talking to. And then I'd be reading and saying, oh yeah, this is familiar. And suddenly it would reference like, you know, Havel or something and be like, well, wait a second. Oh, this is 1988. That's right. It's just, I don't know what word you can use to describe these repeated cycles that just almost follow the same playbook on both sides, except of course, as we get later into the story, 2021 did take a remarkable turn. Yeah. But I also want to ask, you know, when I was out of I was out of Myanmar when this was all happening, and this had been my home for so long, and so to see images of what was happening in streets that I was so familiar with and people that I knew so well, it was, well, obviously the overused word in this case is surreal. That's the word you keep coming back to. There's something surreal about it. To look at these very, very familiar sites and see the kind of unrest and danger and just insanity that was going on. But in your case, you were, it must have been surreal, if we could use that word again, in a different way, because you were physically there. You talk about outside your home, the barricades, the confusion, the different defense people that are starting to take over. So what was it like actually physically being present at a place that you'd called home in, you know, for however many nights, full, you know, years and nights that you had all kinds of boring and mundane and various encounters in your daily life, and then suddenly this place that you know so well in this normal mundane sense has been transformed into something really, really taking on a very different energy.
Yeah, because it would start in the morning times with the protest chants, and because we were right in the middle of downtown, that would be the thing that would start the day. You could hear them echoing from the balcony, so it'd come downstairs. And then from my perspective, because I was covering them, I was more focused on, okay, who can I talk to? You know, how can I get the best coverage from today? Which kind of gave me a focus and a lens to look through it in a more slightly detached way, perhaps, because focusing on like doing the job. But yeah, in the evening times, when some of us would meet together and we would reflect on like the seismic events that were unfolding in front of us, then it was surreal in the evenings, I would say. And also like every now and then, I remember outside Yangon General Hospital where I'd spent half a day seeing if they were bringing in injured protesters. And this nun came up to me and she was like, you got to send in the drones. And I was like, what? And she said, yeah, like you know, like you did with Osama bin Laden, send in the drones and take out men online. You know, so moments like that where it's like, whoa, what's going on? But I was mostly running on adrenaline during that time and trying to do the best reporting that I could do.
It also makes me think, you know, we have so many, especially in this age, so many TV shows and movies that are post-apocalyptic, whether they're zombies or civil wars or meteors or whatever it is. And there's some kind of morbid fascination people have of seeing a familiar world, usually the US, a familiar world that has been transformed into a place where the normal rules don't follow and people kind of have to forge their own community and reality. And so, and this also kind of gets into the later post-coup environment down the line of years of these things kind of falling away. But you were, and we'll get into that, but this is a good lead-in for when this normality and this veneer of civilization and of laws you're supposed to follow and unwritten rules, written and unwritten rules, this is when it starts to fall away and peel back. And so did you feel that at the time? Did you feel that there's this new reality that's suddenly taking shape and people are trying to figure out what it is and how to live in it?
I think so, yeah. Because it's, I mean, we're 3 years on now, and my experiences and my opinions now have been shaped so much with the last couple of years that it's difficult in a way to remember what I was actually thinking at that time. But we could see already that people's lives were being changed forever. Young students realized that just after COVID, their university studies were going to be delayed further. And then obviously when the violence began, that's when their friends started to be shot and killed, and you know, NLD officials being disappeared, and some turning up on the news with, I'm sorry to be graphic about things, but they'd been tortured and photographed. I won't get into it too much like that, but yeah, that's when I think, yeah, things couldn't go back for sure.
So let's get into your story, because at some point you obviously realized that you yourself cannot keep up your life in Yangon. Things had reached a certain point. When did you realize that, and what did you do?
Yeah, so I think a couple of weeks into the violence, in the night time, soldiers would start marching down the streets and people would turn off their lights as the soldiers shined flashlights into the rooms, right? And that's when doors were broken down, and journalists, NGO staff, party officials would start to go missing or like just be taken out on the street. The pots and pans were still going. So I know your audience is very familiar with Myanmar, but that was one thing that really stuck out. If anyone isn't familiar with it, is that there's a tradition in Myanmar to bang pots and pans loudly, which is meant to kind of scare the evil away, right? And people began to do that after the coup at 8 p.m. every night. And the first time that happened in downtown, again, I was on my bicycle, right? Because I was told that it was going to happen. And I was cycling through the streets, and then suddenly this just like huge metal clattering orchestra erupts everywhere. And you think, how can the military possibly suppress the spirit of the people here? It was, even then, it felt so powerful, right? So enormous. So I realized that I had to leave a couple of months after the coup, when soldiers were smashing down doors in the night, and our own house and our neighbors were being harassed by soldiers in the evening with, torchlights and stuff. So I think most journalists around that time, some local journalists decided to stay on, which is incredibly brave. But I think most foreign journalists realized that it would be a wise decision to leave around then. So my friend had organized a flight. I think the flights had stopped around then. So he organized a couple of flights to Bangkok. And on the 8th of April, I got on one of those flights. And that was around the time where we were like, hey, we should go. Our good friend, Danny Fenster, we were like, hey, we should all leave now. And he's like, well, I'm low profile, I'll stay for a little bit and then I'll go. And yeah, he was arrested at the airport a few weeks later.
Right, so you leave Yangon on this about 2 months after the coup or so. And what did it feel like to be on that plane and leaving this country you had spent so much time in, now in the state that it's in? And then as you left, where did you go next when you landed in Bangkok?
Yeah, so I went to Bangkok. I did like 10 days of COVID quarantine where I could think about and start to try to absorb what had happened. I felt emotional, and I felt a bit overwhelmed with everything. So it was probably good that I had 10 days by myself in a room to process things, or try to. But I also felt like this was the beginning of what was happening. Again, the kind of the power of the people and the spirit of the people told me that this was only the beginning of what was happening. So I stayed in Bangkok for a few months, and then I moved to southern Thailand for a few months, and then I just kind of stayed around Thailand every day, keeping track of the situation and what was going on.
And so now at this point, you can't go back to Myanmar. You certainly can't go back in formal official ways through an airport, but you continue to report on the story. So talk about how you use your background and profession as a journalist to continue to report on the story, and how you were involved, who you're reporting for, and what the story started to develop in this first year and second year, and we'll bring it up to today.
Yeah, so I think there's an argument to not be in Yangon at all back then and now, because you get people into danger just purely by the fact of being a journalist and talking to people around there. The environment is very claustrophobic, and it's difficult to operate as a journalist there. So you think, oh, there's no journalists in Yangon. Well, there's still like local journalists who are working there and doing great work. But the real story, or maybe the more compelling story within the first year, came from the ethnic areas, where the ethnic insurgents were training these demonstrators who had fled the regime's violence but weren't going to give up that easily. And because I was following it every day, I started to sense and feel like more confident that the resistance forces were actually liberating some areas. And of course, if there's a liberated area, there's no reason not to go there. So, because that's where you see actually what's happening. So, I mean, I was all, sometimes you can be all talk about, oh yeah, the resistance are doing a great job and everything's liberated, and it's like, well, why aren't you there then, right? Like, if it's that great, you should go and check it out. But it was a kind of nervous time then, because I've done a few trips into Myanmar, and at the beginning we were kind of edging our way in a bit by bit. So first it would be a camp for displaced people, a few hours inside, and then the next trip would be a bit further in, and then it started to sink in of what we were seeing in front of us, which was indeed a lot of territory that had been liberated from the regime.
And this is early on you're talking about?
Yeah, I think the first story that we did was from inside, was maybe September 2022, I'm tempted to say. Yeah. And
what were those early experiences like in going into the country? Were you hesitant? Was there fear, safety precautions, and also how were you impacted by the scenes you were seeing and people you were meeting?
Yeah, so the first time after the coup of going into a liberated area was nerve-wracking, because we didn't know what to expect, or whether we would have trouble in the border, or what the realities were in terms of ambushes or airstrikes. And the border crossing, well, I won't go into detail about that, but there's always kind of the unpredictable element of what can happen. So you want to kind of get away from the border as soon as you can. And then once we got inside the first time, there were about 4,000 or 5,000 displaced people who we'd met, and they'd just done this huge walk from around the Pruso, Loiko, Damoso, and towards Thailand. And they were families, elderly people, disabled people, who had been walking for 10 days, sometimes longer, and they were, exhausted, they had barely any belongings, trying to build huts in this IDP camp. So, yeah, they were all heading towards that direction. And the further I went in after that, the more I would see displaced people, even in the night time, walking through the jungle, carrying their babies, tripping up on tree roots, without much food or shelter, exposed to the elements, being guided by the Karenni army and the KNDF, who are escorting them to safe areas.
Was it difficult to keep an objective frame of mind as a journalist as you were seeing this shape of humanity before you?
I don't think you can be objective, especially when it comes to Myanmar. I think objectivity is a bit of a myth. So, yeah. I mean, you don't want to be a partisan, right? You don't, like, especially these days, this is becoming more of an issue with the revolution, that because everybody knows the Myanmar regime is so brutal, and if we're going to look at it in a kind of good guy, bad guy, who are the bad guys? Right, we know who the bad guys are, in that simple terms. But the truth is, journalists aren't resistance fighters, and if you're a journalist, you shouldn't be a cheerleader for the resistance just because the regime are bad. But saying that, obviously when you're seeing the destruction and the terror that the regime are causing, well, that's the reality of it, right? So you don't, just by reporting the reality of that, that's enough, I think, to do. Yeah.
But then you also came to spend a lot of time with PDFs, with EAOs, EROs, various fighters, and definitely want to get into what you saw of this culture and community. Before we do that, just touching upon what it was like being a journalist, sometimes embedded with them, sometimes in the area and reporting on them. We've talked before the interview about some of the challenges that you had in terms of having them understand what basic journalism was, and that you weren't there to tell the story they wanted you to tell and that was good for them. You were there to try to give a more, there's that word again, objective understanding. And so can you describe some of those challenges and how you dealt with them?
Yeah, I think that I mean, for the trips in Karenni, that wasn't so much of a problem before. But it's becoming a bit more of a challenge to, sometimes there's an assumption that everybody's on the same page, the journalists and the whatever resistance group or figures. But it's more complicated than that, right? Journalists are there to talk to as many people as they can, and among those people there'll be some disagreements or tensions, but the journalist isn't there to represent one particular group. So I think I remind myself that I should probably make sure there's a better understanding before going into something sometimes. Yeah.
Mm-hmm, right. We also talked about how you personally are growing increasingly interested in the color of the environment that you're in and wanting to represent that and bring that to life, and that in a lot of the reporting you do, it's more of the basic developments and details and news. And so obviously on a podcast, this is a great chance to be able, on a podcast like ours, which is not reporting what happened yesterday, but giving a general overview of someone's life and views, it's a much better opportunity to be able to give that color to listeners. And so I want to open it up to you to describe, and I think this is very interesting for me, it's very interesting for our listeners, because we hear, for those that know about Myanmar, we know about the fighters and the conflict, and we hear the news, we read, we see pictures, we see images and videos, but the question that I always have, and what you've gone into describing with the color, is what does it feel like? What does it actually feel like to be here? If I'm virtually there and I'm talking to people and I'm seeing things and I'm hearing things and I'm getting a sense of the motivations and the environment, anything from what are they actually eating and cooking to where are these people from and why are they doing what they're doing and what's the motivation and how is it sustaining, any of those things, any direction you want to go in. What can you tell us about the color that we're missing from a lot of the articles that are coming out?
Yeah, so from our perspective outside of Myanmar, we see that headlines about how the resistance has liberated this area or that area, and it's the PDF and the military are in the towns. And it can feel sometimes a little abstract and intangible to think, oh, what is actually the reality of that? So going out to southern Myanmar or eastern Myanmar and seeing these places gives it a much more textured reality of the different groups and the tensions among the different groups, and meeting all of the different characters out there, and seeing like how the situations differ between places as well. So from what I've seen so far, in at least the east and southeast of Myanmar, the ethnic areas have been more badly bombed and targeted than, say, Tananthari region at the moment. That's not to say that that will change, because I think that this year there will be big changes around Tananthari as well. Let's take the last trip for an example. So once we got across, we drove through a main road. So you're driving through for like hours, a big main road where it's completely under the resistance control. And the tricky thing is there's a lot of different groups around there. So in that case, there was like the Kothule army, the KNLA, there's a PLA, the communist groups, there's a PDF, there's the local militias around there. And then there's always that lingering threat of the military in the towns. But once you're inside, you kind of think, right, well, there's no going back now. We're like 6-8 hours in, and then further, then close to the Andaman Sea. And so you think, well, what is this going to look like? Is this going to look like a kind of crazy conflict zone with people running around and like, you know, skeletons of buildings and the whistling of artillery? Actually, in that case, it was just a stunning southern Myanmar set of riverside villages, palm-flanked rivers, silhouetted mountains, you know, the smell of dried fish and cheroots. And you think, well, where's the conflict around here? But it doesn't take much to see the conflict. You just need to scratch the surface slightly. There's empty houses. Oh, a Dalan, a military informer, used to live in that house, but then they escaped. Or why is the hospital empty? Oh, because then the military will bomb it if there are people in the hospital. Who's in the police station? Oh, the PDF are living in that police station now. Is this a fire station? Oh no, it's a prison now for, I don't know, drug abusers and Dalan and whoever. So in the non-bombed areas, there are aspects like that. Some of the people that we met on the last trip, so there was one guy called Ong Mio who used to be a resistance fighter back in '88 for the group called the ABSTF, and he was working with the KNU back then. And then for him, the war fizzled out in 1996, 97, and he became, he had different jobs, so he became a worker on a cargo ship around Malaysia. He worked in a monastery for a while. And you know, he became like a market, selling things in the market for a bit. And then after a while, when the NLD started, had the successful election, he became an NLD activist and went back to his home in Tanintharyi region. And then after the coup, he realized that he'd need to fight again. So he was facilitating young demonstrators and then helping to train them. But he's 53 as well. And he was a very vigilant guy. He was always on the lookout for danger. He's someone who you kind of felt safe when you were next to. And he kept these, a bracelet of monkey bones in his satchel. And every time his legs were tired, he'd rub the monkey bones onto his legs, which, yeah, he said would help, you know, relieve the muscles a bit. So he was the bodyguard of a PDF leader in that area. And I felt like the kind of the contours of his own life reflected the modern history of Myanmar. And there were plenty of colourful characters and interesting people like that you'd meet who had relatively normal lives after having this revolutionary period. And then in the 50s, 60s, they picked up the gun again, and people in the community looked towards them for guidance and support and said, hey, we don't want to send our children to, I don't know, this area, or we don't want them to necessarily even join the PDF. We want to send them to like this local community leader, right, who's now a militia leader again. Yeah, and during that time as well, we met you know, an NLD MP who had become the head of security in this township, and she was looking after the prison, which was in the fire station. We met a lot of young people. I remember being in the truck for a while with maybe like 5 or 6 girls who, you know, they looked like they should be in school, but they were going to school, but the school was actually a converted PDF barracks where they were training. And they're going to go off to fight one of the most brutal militaries in Asia, you know? There's people who are deeply traumatized with tics and are unable, understandably, to process their experiences, who have had their limbs blown off or who have lost friends. The young people in those areas around Tanintharyi, they would, the local guy who I was with was always cracking jokes, but a lot of those guys aren't really able to get the jokes, right? Not because maybe they were bad jokes, I don't know, but it's more because their life has become so serious, so much about like life or death in those areas. So they would point out like, an abandoned house where they had to sleep for 5 days, or they would reminisce about, after the coup when we had no weapons, that's where we hid for 3 days behind that tree, or for them it's like the landmarks around that, they all tell this like crazy story, and that they relate to in their own experiences.
You also had shared a couple days ago this idea of this a feeling that some of these towns kind of had this feel of a Wild West frontier town, and you've described that a little bit in your description just now, but can you expand onto that metaphor of what were you seeing and experiencing that made you feel like you were like this was a frontier town that had just a semblance of law behind it?
Yeah, so for that trip in Tanintharyi, I don't want to give the impression that it was lawless, because I think that the NUG administration were doing a good job of keeping things in check there. Although that's another complicated thing, because when you get a lot of young, fairly untrained people, or not necessarily young, but just a lot of people with guns suddenly, it can be a recipe for disaster in the future. But what I've felt around there is that, so in Myanmar, as you will know, wherever you are, you always feel pretty welcome, right? Like the generosity of people is astonishing. Mm-hmm. Even during these difficult times, you're constantly fed amazing food, and that all of that is very humbling. And the sense of community is so strong because they've been neglected by the state for so long. In that one particular town, there was a kind of community center with these notice boards pinned onto the building, just basically like decreeing the law of the land. This is the PDF law, and there was 7 or 8 sheets just detailing like, okay, this is the law, this is how people should behave. And most of it was kind of uncontroversial stuff. Don't let your dog bite somebody, or like various farming practices. But if people ever thought, hey, what can or can't do, like the law was pinned to the building now, so you can just go and see it, And then in that kind of area, as in most conflicts, there is always this sense of paranoia about military informers, and suspicion, and who to trust, especially newcomers. During that time, there were many newcomers who were escaping the Myanmar military's conscription, and so people had to be vetted carefully to make sure that there weren't any spies coming into the community. And there is a sense of shame for joining the revolution so late for those people. Not for everybody, but for some. So nobody wants to admit that they came there because they were fleeing the conscription. They want to say, well, we realize that now is the time to join the PDF. But also not everybody wants to fight either. And some people are honest about that. Some people aren't meant to be fighters.
Is there something they can do? Is there a way that you saw people resisting in a way other than armed conflict, or has it been driven to these polarities, these black and white polarities?
No, there were people who were wanting to use their skills for the resistance administration. So the NUG is often criticized for not being on the ground, and I think that that's a legitimate criticism for some ministers, but the truth is there is an NUG administration that's on the ground, and it's mostly run by ousted NLD MPs in that area. And in an administration, you need a lot of civil servants to run education and health and humanitarian sector, and a lot of other different sectors to think about. So these young people who are well educated and might not want to fight, they would use their skills in the administration. Or if they didn't want to do that, one of the local administrators told me that they would make sure that they found them accommodation and some land, and they could do other work, maybe agricultural work or construction or whatever could work. In Myanmar, it's not a big revelation to say that things are complicated. It's not just the PDF versus the military, or the PDF working with the ethnic armed groups versus the military. Your audience, most of them will know that anyway. What surprised me is that even down to the township in some places, there's at least like 7 or 8 different armed groups. And the feature looks very complicated even without the military. Mm-hmm. So in some places, I'll ask myself, why, if there's say 4,000 or 5,000 resistance fighters in this township and there's 100 Myanmar military soldiers left, can't you just overrun them? But intentionally they don't overrun them because they know that there'll be a vacuum of power as soon as they've gone.
I see.
And when those soldiers have gone, there'll be a higher likelihood of the resistance forces fighting against each other for control over different roads or different resources. Now, I'm not saying that this is happening right now, although it has happened in some places. It's a reality, a potential that people need to bear in mind. When we went to Taninthari, I stopped at a Kothule army camp, and I won't go into the background of the Kothule army unless you want me to, but a commander there who's a very experienced guy and has fought the military along with within the KNLA for a while as well. I asked him, why don't you take out that military base in Modong, which is the important border area around there? Because everybody says you can, or everyone around here says that you can do it. So what's stopping you guys from doing it? Well, he said, if we do that, we have to think first about evacuating the whole town and making sure that they're safe and where they should be. And then we can expect reprisals from the military in the form of airstrikes. And from their airbase, I think in Miek to Modong, it's about a 4-minute flight, and they will just destroy that town. So we keep the soldiers there in the understanding that if the military attack us in what we think is a kind of unfair way, then we'll go for them in that Modong town. There's an unspoken understanding, right? That's what he said. Mm-hmm. But again, in other areas, in Anya region, I've been told that some soldiers who are kind of stranded in these outposts or in these towns that are surrounded by PDFs, they have to ask permission to go to the market sometimes to get food. And you ask yourself the question, why aren't the resistance just attacking them, right?
Yeah, right.
I think a lot of it is to do with the fear of reprisals and the airstrikes that will follow after that. But also, in some places, there's that factor of the power vacuum. It's better, from some people's perspectives, to keep the military in some places while they discuss who gets what. And once they've finished those discussions and there's agreements, then they can take out that base in some areas.
That's just insane. I have so many questions about that are just running through my mind saying that. I mean, first, I just want to clarify, you're depicting an image of various fighting groups that are each with their own bands and motivations, and an outpost of soldiers that are in active conflict and combat, and somehow within this fighting that's taking place, the soldiers are like, well, can you give us just a few hours to stop the fighting, because we need to go buy some cooking oil and rice and eggs or something at the market, and then once we get back safely, we can resume our little conflict. And that's I guess that's the first question I'll leave with. Is that the picture that you're painting?
Yeah, but not as instant as, okay, we're gonna stop, like in, that story from World War I where the German and English soldiers stop on Christmas Eve or whatever to play football. It's not like that, from my understanding. And it's not active conflict every day either. there comes to develop an understanding of we're not shooting each other every day, but we can shoot each other every day if this side doesn't get this, right, or that side doesn't get that. So there has to be some communication going on because everybody's like speaking the same language, right? So not as extreme as, okay, stop, okay, go to the market, okay, continue the combat, but an understanding that it feels very like unsustainable, the situation, but in order to prevent huge human and building losses during that time, there needs to be some like local communication between the actors on the ground until like the bigger picture develops, and then either side will make a move.
The other thing I'm thinking as you say this, as you talk about the power vacuum, I hear that with an optimistic ear and a pessimistic ear. And the pessimistic ear that I hear that through is those kind of military apologists that we've heard so often throughout the years and the generations of, well, they're too big to fill, and they always have to have some hand in the country, and if you were to remove them, then the vacuum that would develop would engulf everything in flames, and that's kind of a justification why they need to be there in some form. And so the pessimistic ear that I'm hearing that in is kind of, and I could hear those apologists listening and nodding and saying, yes, 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 this is why we keep saying the military needs to have a role in the country's future and why they can't go away. And even in this dramatic story of even these different units that all have a similar shared goal of the military being toppled are not toppling certain military positions that they very well could because they're afraid of this power vacuum. So it's kind of justifying that pessimistic view. The optimistic view I want to balance that with is there's another way to hear what you said, and this might be optimistic trending towards idealistic naivete, and that's what I want to get your view on, that's saying, well, actually what you're saying is not that these military outposts and positions need to remain there forever, and that this strong man and needs to exist in some ways because these groups can't come together. What you're saying is that this needs to be delayed as this long process is continuing, and they're coming to understanding, they're working towards the federal democracy that they all want, and that once they come into harmony and hold hands and understand how they can all work together, then in harmony they'll go and topple those bases and be able to control the country in a peaceful and organized manner. So these are two extremes, the optimistic and pessimistic way to take this in. Maybe both of them are too extreme for the accurate interpretation of how we should derive meaning from what you shared. Can you respond to your view on what this means in kind of the larger narrative of Myanmar?
So we're discussing various local situations, and everywhere is different. Everywhere will have its own unique set of dynamics between the military and the resistance actors in that area. We should make very clear that you and I will agree, and also the people on the ground understand, the problems began with the military, and the problems are exacerbated by the military, and ultimately the only resolution to this big problem is when the military goes. So the fact that some military bases continue to exist, although the resistance could probably capture them in some areas, is not testament to the military keeping the country together at all. They're on a journey, the resistance is, of figuring out what the future looks like, from village to township to state or region to a country as a whole. So there's in my opinion, there's no argument about about the military keeping the country together in any way at all. They're the ones who've caused all of this carnage, and people ordinary people on the ground understand that more than any of us do. My thoughts on that is, it's because it's better to discuss things while there's not a temptation there to quickly pounce on something that becomes available. And I think that that's the mature and better way of approaching it. And there are a lot of wise commanders on the ground, and they understand that as well. So, well, that's the reason why they're doing it. The reason why I know this is because they told me it, right? So, like, they'd rather discuss things with all of the various actors outside of the military before taking actions and leaving an opening for future conflict. Now, I will just use Tanithari again as an example of what we've been discussing. And this is a very sensitive topic, and I might get in trouble for talking about this too much, but it's important to have these real conversations about what's going on. So in Tanithari, you have the KNU's Brigade 4, which is the biggest force around there. And then you have the PDF, which I guess is the second biggest force. The PDF themselves have got some divisions around there as well. But we can say that the PDF, or overall the NUG's armed wing in that area. Now, some of those PDF leaders come from an NLD background, and they bring a lot of baggage with them in terms of relations with the Karen around there. So when they're presented with the possibility of wiping out the military in that area, they need to discuss things beforehand about who gets what, and about where the territorial lines are marked between the villages and who administers what. So again, I think that Tanithari region will see a lot more conflict soon. I just really hope that those conversations are happening before the military is completely wiped out around those areas, or before they're pushed just to the towns. Now, both sides also have legitimate concerns. The PDF around there are saying, hey, well, let me start first by saying both sides have a common enemy, and the KNLA have really helped the PDF by training them at the beginning in Tanithari, and also providing some weapons and selling them these days. And I believe that they can work things out, and I really hope they can. But the PDF are frustrated with the KNLA because they feel like they have abided by the national ceasefire agreement and have not attacked the military as much as they would have hoped, and have not supported them. During the peace process in Myanmar, the National Ceasefire Agreement, or NCA, was this very important landmark event where some important ethnic armed groups and the Myanmar military signed up to an agreement that they wouldn't attack each other. And it was seen as this step forward for Myanmar, and the end, a partial end to one of the longest running civil wars in the world. But it was a flawed agreement. I think there were about 15 armed groups altogether who signed up to it, and it was completely undermined by the military coup on the 1st of February. So if you're interested in the ceasefire agreement, you can check it out online. But after the coup, it was made redundant, yet there are PDF who think that the Karen National Union in southern Myanmar are still abiding by that flawed and redundant agreement, and it's a source of frustration. There are also reports of Brigade 4's previous business involvements, which are questionable in the revolution, and so the PDF want Brigade 4 to help them more with the fight. Now, on the other side of things, the Karen have been subjected to violence and suppression by the military for forever, right, around there, for decades and decades, and now all of a sudden the ethnic Burma need help, and the Karen is expected to give it, right, when they didn't really have the acknowledgement or help in the past that they needed. So why should they be the ones to give it now? Is what some of them kind of think, right? It's a very complicated picture around there, as you know. Yeah, so they need to resolve those differences and come to a common understanding and agree to control over the territory and over the natural resources like the metal mines in those areas, so that they can move forward and take out the military there. And the KNU has 7 different brigades, each with their own unique relationship with the resistance in that area. It was described to me by somebody on the ground that the big ship of the KNU Brigade 4 is turning, and it's turning towards combat with the military. And I believe that that's going to be ultimately, or I hope it will be ultimately, a positive thing for relations between the KNU and the PDF in that area. Now, the NLD MPs are facing criticism around there because they believe that they have a mandate, and their mandate has transcended the parliament from which they were ousted to becoming militia leaders. And now, instead of carrying pens in parliament, they've got AK-47s, and they're commanding like hundreds or sometimes thousands of fighters. But they don't have as much military experience, obviously, as the KNLA does around there. So there's a lot of voices from PDF and KNLA to say, hey, hang on a sec, let's spend our time becoming a very disciplined army before we take the next step. But there's part of the PDF there who just want revenge now, which again is totally understandable. They want to fight the military ASAP. They don't want to let things continue to the point where people lose sight of the ultimate goals, because ethnic armed groups have been fighting the military for so long that sometimes the leaderships can lose sight of why they're doing it for. So they don't want to fall into that trap, and they want to attack now. So that's another source of tensions. And this mandate that the NLD MPs believe that they have around there is questionable when that election was held under a military drafted constitution, the 2008 constitution. How far do you want the revolution to go? Do you want the revolution to stop at the 2008 constitution and get the NLD back in government because they were elected? Or do you want this to be a full-blown revolution that goes much deeper than that and completely gets rid of the constitution? In which case, no, you don't have a mandate, because that was held under a military drafted constitution. So you can go for an election again and you probably will win it, hopefully. Okay, go for it. But for now, you have to decide how far this revolution is going to go. It's another source of tensions around that area, and probably one that's being replicated in other areas as well.
So if I were to ask you a really impossible theoretical question, but I'll ask anyway, if the military were to fall today and they were to dissolve, pick your poison, your reason why the military suddenly ceases to exist in any form that we know it, the entire country is open for the taking, what would you anticipate the challenges would be at that point? And this is obviously a hotly debated question among experts, some again on the optimistic side that are predicting this kind of solidarity like we've never seen before, and which is very true, and this work towards wanting to create a federal charter and structure so that this situation will not happen in the future. We also hear a lot about that, and the more pessimistic side of the extraordinary complexities and challenges that face us. So if that scenario were to happen today, what kind of challenges and complexities and concerns do you would you have in that immediate post-coup reality?
Yeah, I mean, they're endless, and they're kind of beyond my capability, right, of really articulating or understanding. Every area of Myanmar will have its own set of challenges. Do you think that the communities in Myanmar are strong? Does it have a strong sense of community?
In general?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that can really work in favor in a situation where the military completely collapses, because people know how to look after each other and how to sustain small villages and towns while not falling into anarchy and chaos or like violent anarchy, you know. So in that sense, I would hope that things could be, not too bad. But I don't think that the resistance overall is ready for that situation yet. I think that things are happening at the right time, at the right speed.
You've talked about going into certain townships or even certain villages and having, I think the number you referenced was 8 different fighting groups that were involved in some form in particular villages. Did you sense a certain tension between that number of representatives and the dialogue and communication that needed to happen, or was it pretty fluid?
It was pretty fluid in that case. I would say that tensions weren't too bad unless we're talking about the bigger groups, like as we discussed with the KNLA and PDF. Again, I don't want to say that they're on the brink of fighting, but they definitely and hopefully will need to have more discussions. But overall, especially if people are from the same area, the tensions aren't too bad. So if you are in the Korthulé Army and I am in the Karen National Liberation Army, perhaps we're from the same village. So when we meet each other, we're not representatives of 2 different groups. We're 2 people from the same village that can talk like that. So it's not too bad in those areas. But I think in other areas that it might be a bit more tense.
So going back to this discussion of the color of the places that you experienced, and it sometimes doesn't get out in the stories. The other kind of color question I want to ask you is the sense you get from the motivation of those who joined the PDF. Because for those listeners that haven't followed, a lot of the Bamar that joined the PDF initially, they were most of them were coming from a background that had nothing to do with fighting in this kind of capacity, coming from university students or IT or just working menial jobs in restaurants or hotels or IT or taxi drivers or whatever. And many of them then went up to take an armed rebellion. And when we hear about the formation of the PDFs, it's often generalized very much as the people that are fighting for restoring democracy and human rights. And I don't want in any way to minimize that. I think that is what drove a lot of the initial formation and activity. It's something really to be lauded that I don't know how many countries we would see that in. It's really quite remarkable the degree to which people were putting their lives on the line to try to create a better future for themselves. But I also want to give shape to a varied reality, and a reality that's gone forward past the initial motivations and incentives to want to move in this direction. And that as this conflict has stretched out, when you've been around different PDF fighters and gotten to know them and seen how they're organized and who's coming. And you've already talked about those that kind of the pressure that some have to join and the ways to try to resist in other ways and the expectation and those types of things. What kind of feel can you tell us about why, beyond the general themes that we hear, which I'm sure have some truth in them, but beyond that, to give more of a varied and colorful reality of what you're experiencing, what you're hearing, how would you describe those individual fighters, why they're there day after day, why they're continuing to do what they do, the sacrifices and hardships that they're facing? What's the range of feelings and motivations you get?
I think the defining feature of that is this belief that the military has to be overthrown and that they have to take control of their own destinies and their own communities. And also that brutal acknowledgement that if the military are in control, then everybody's futures are down the drain, and you'll constantly have lives of fear and be exposed to kidnap and torture and everything else that the military brings with it. But if you're an, say, 18-year-old boy or girl and you're in the middle of this revolution, what are the reasons to, other than this kind of commitment to overthrowing the military, would make you join your group? Well, an armed group. Ethnicity is important in a lot of areas, and that can be the driving factor. Peer pressure is important. If you are, say, 18, 19, 20, and you're not joining a group, why? Especially if you're a young man. are you a coward? Why aren't you joining this group and fighting with the rest of us? You know, what have you sacrificed when you're trying to continue with your life while we are putting our lives on the line every day to overthrow the military? So there's an element, I think, of peer pressure there as well. Also, I think there's a drive to want to, just like, you want respect, right? You want respect as a young person, and the way to get respect in that environment is to be a fighter, is to go out there and to prove yourself in the ultimate test, which is having to, for instance, run towards a trench and try to kill as many soldiers as you can. And once you do that, you know, you've proved yourself really in the highest way for some people, I think.
I want to ask you a question I asked a couple days ago and get your answer on air. It's a question about your own trips into Myanmar and a time when you faced great danger. And the reason why I want to ask this question is not just to highlight your own personal story of the conflict and the fear that was happening to you personally, but because there's this, as we'll learn in your answer and go into, it's not just what happened to you, but it's seeing how you responded to this scary situation differently than everyone else who'd been living in that kind of context for so long, which is another way to bring out the color of the trauma and the trauma that's not happening just at one scary moment, but that's happening over extended periods and goes into this trauma that so many are facing now, both the civilian population as well as those taking up arms.
Yeah, so I'll throw out a caveat at the beginning to say that I'm not a brave person, as you'll find out from the story, and I don't know much about military affairs and if the situation is right and if you can assess the risks and trust the people that you're with, because we're living through historic times and we should witness that as much as we can from the ground. Like, it doesn't matter whether you're from Myanmar or a foreigner. If your job is journalism and you can do it, you have to go on the ground, right? I think that gives you a much more holistic view of things. So in that situation that you referenced, we had just finished a long hike into Demoso, and I'd brought the wrong boots because I'm an idiot, and it was like my second trip, and it was a bigger one inside, and so I hated myself during the walk. I bought these big European boots that I'd ripped off the skin from the top of my feet, and so then I had to wear my flip-flops. But of course, like, the guys around me are like bouncing around in their flip-flops, jumping up mountains, and I was like, oh God. So we get to where we needed to go, and then there's a big meeting of resistance figures in the forest. You know, we're looking around. I was like, oh, there's a lot of people here. Anytime there's a lot of people, you're always a bit wary about, could we be a target? And then we see a surveillance drone come past. The commander who we were with at the time, a Karenni army commander, was very composed and very experienced. So he directed us, after a short ride in the truck, to come out of the truck and to go on either side of a road down to a dried out ravine. And so we follow his instructions, and I get down to this kind of watering hole, and I think, oh, that's a perfect place where I can wash my feet and, like, you know, put some cream on them or whatever. And the drone goes away. So I look towards the commander and I'm like, oh great, the drone's gone. I go to the water, but he looks over and he's like, no, basically they're getting our location so that they can better direct the artillery. So as I'm washing my feet, suddenly the artillery comes whistling in, and then there's an explosion, and then the next explosion is a bit closer, and I'm crouched down in the middle of a kind of small group of Karenni army soldiers, and these soldiers are 19 years old, I would say, and it's their first ever experience of combat, just like me. So we're all kind of in the same boat in there. But I didn't know that. I thought these might be kind of like young veterans. And I look over to one on my left-hand side, this young guy who I've become friendly with, and I kind of plead with my eyes for some kind of direction from him, but he just crosses his hands and starts to pray. So I do exactly the same thing as well. I'm like, okay, that's the plan, let's do that. So I start praying as well, and then the next bomb comes in, even closer, the next shell in, and I look over and I see this like amazing little spot in between the two big rocks, and it's like, that's my dream Airbnb right now. I want to be in between, I want to be inside the rock. So barefoot, I sprint across and I hide in between these two rocks. And there's a few more shell-ins, and after that it stops and it seems everything's fine. The commander comes up and he says, hey, you guys are gonna have to stay here for a while because the situation's unpredictable and volatile. So we say, yeah, no problem. I'm still cushioned between the rocks. This is like my safe place now. And shortly after, a KNDF soldier comes to see us, and he's like so nonchalant. We can still hear the shelling, but it's further away now. And he's so nonchalant and almost fatalistic in his kind of vibe of, you know, lying in the middle of this like dried out ravine without much caution to the dangers that are surrounding us. But yeah, it's something that made me quickly realize that, first of all, I'm a total coward. And secondly, these guys, and also just normal villagers as well, they're living with this danger every day, every second of every day. And you can't live in that environment and constantly be afraid. You get tired and bored, I think, of being afraid every day. So these guys and girls are incredibly brave and almost nonchalant sometimes in the face of danger, because they're living with it all of the time, you know.
And you talked about meeting people that just had shrapnel all over themselves and that had any number of injuries. You already referenced the people with the post-traumatic stress that would have strange tics or other kind of things they were working through.
Yeah. There was many fighters, like anybody who's reported from Karenni or anywhere else in Myanmar would have seen many injured fighters and injured civilians, often through landmine blasts or through shelling. If they are caught by the military, more often than not, they don't come back. They're tortured to death. But yeah, that's just a horrible fact of life out there. So you'll meet a lot of amputees out there. There was one lady actually who I met in Karenni State in an IDP camp, and she kind of brought the realities to life for me about what civilians have to go through. She was just going home one day from an IDP camp to check on her house, and she went to the bathroom outside her house before she was leaving, and there was a landmine put by the bathroom that she said that she thought the military planted it there, and she lost part of her arm and her leg. And I went to go see her and have a cup of tea, and she was smiling and joking. She was with her elderly mother and his son, and I was thinking, wow, this lady's like incredible, you know. She's like still able to have a joke and make me feel really comfortable there, and I was trying to make her feel comfortable before the interview. And then during the interview, I ask her a question, and suddenly she just breaks down. Her face collapses, and she's just she's in tears. There's moments like that where I think, like, what am I actually doing? You know, why am I actually? It makes me question why I'm there as well. Have I come here as some random foreigner just to make this lady who's been through hell relive that hell and cry just so I can have like a sentence or two in an article? Like, is it even worth that? And also, obviously, I get to go back to Thailand or wherever and be nice and cozy and safe. This lady's like still living in this makeshift hut after losing her home and her limbs. And yeah, I don't know. Sometimes now, when I'm doing stories, and I just don't want to. I don't want to see people. I don't want to bring people to tears. You know. Sometimes that can be good for stories, that You have to bring out the emotion. But these days, if someone's crying because of questions that I'm asking, I don't know, I don't like it so much.
That's really heavy, and I understand the burden that you're feeling. I also just want to be one voice that I think other listeners that are following along up to now would have some sense of your character and your integrity as you're trying to report on this, and feel that and want to express a thank you of gratitude for everything that you've been doing and for how you've been telling this story and integrating into places where, as you say, if you're a journalist, foreign or Burmese, but especially foreign, then and you have a way to go here and report, that's you inferred almost beyond a professional duty. It's almost a kind of ethical duty to come and bring that story, and for whatever the burden is that as you navigate these ethics and safety and everything else, as you're able to navigate that balance, I think, to whatever degree you're able to go and make these relationships and get these stories and bring this awful reality to the ears and eyes of people who need to know it, I think I say thank you. I think others would say that as well, with a sense of compassion for the heaviness and the burden of what you have to go through to get across the finish line and some of the stories that you're doing. And that also leads to wondering, as I'm hearing you talk and hearing all of these firsthand reports of sometimes of conflict zones and what we're seeing in terms of different fighting forces and the lay of the land, in some ways talking about the color of what people are living through and how this country has been going through this devastation for 3.5 years, I just can't help but think what I've been thinking myself for 3.5 years, which is why does this conversation we're having, why does it feel so isolated? Why is it not something that we're seeing on the front of so many pages and being followed, this human drama that's unfolding in a place of enormous geopolitical importance on top of that? And this unfolding story that has so many twists and turns, and that has a people and a humanity that's living through it. I'm preaching to the choir. I know I'm just shouting at a wall. But I just and this was something I would say a lot in 2021 that I've kind of let go of. But it's coming up in me again, hearing you say this, and there's this sense of frustration and exasperation. And as much as I think I've accepted that reality, it still comes home at times like this.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for the thanks, but I will kind of like politely reject that a little bit, because those of us who follow Myanmar closely, we're all doing what we can. We're all ultimately in this together, and my own tiny role in this, I doubt the use of a lot anyway. So what we can do is just do what we think is best as much as we can. But yeah, I mean, we know who the significant players are in this. We know the people who are sacrificing the most, and those are the people who are living inside Myanmar during these times and bravely standing up to the military. And the trips that I've taken will never have been possible without the bravery of people. And I sometimes think what I would have done in that situation, when you've got such a violent juggernaut like the military facing you, would you have the bravery and the guts to say, like, no, I'm gonna, I don't know, hide in the jungle for a bit, I'm gonna learn how to make a bomb, I'm gonna learn how to fight back? I'm not sure I'd be able to do that, but people are doing it, and because of that I'm able to go out there and then meet other people who are living out there. I don't think that we can get caught up on this idea that the world isn't paying enough attention to Myanmar, because I think it's a fruitless endeavor.
Yeah.
I think that we need to just focus on what we do. Like, you're doing an excellent job in what you do. You're bringing a lot of different people together. You're having conversations which have taught me a lot personally through listening to the podcast. And you've said yourself, you're developing at it, you're becoming better and better, and it's a really valuable contribution to what's happening. Again, without it, it's good for me because I've been exposed to a lot of different voices because of it. So we can all just do in our little way what we're doing. We don't have control over the other things. if I try to convince an editor to run a Myanmar story and they say no for whatever reason, something else is happening in the world, or they don't like the angle, or too much color probably. That's it, right? Yeah, you just gotta try again somewhere else, or you've got to think of another way that you can do it.
The other thing that strikes me in that story is just the open display of emotion. And for those that don't know Myanmar society so well, just open displays of emotion is, especially with someone not close to you, is not something you usually see just in Burmese culture. And so I think that's another thing that that strikes me about that experience is that these emotional breakdowns that you've been witnessing that are very normal and very human, but they're also, just to highlight and underscore that, they do stand out from what we know of typical Burmese culture, that in the care one has in how one shows one's emotions in public places and to outsiders.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, because the situations are so extreme that people are more likely to show their emotions even to a foreign stranger like myself, which again, I don't forget. I'll give you another quick story about a lady in Tanithai region. We can call her, let's call her Sanda, because she didn't want her name to come out. We met her in the back of a shop where she was peeling betel nut because her friend had hired her. And a few months previous, so this lady's in her mid-50s, and she had a son who was a volunteer ambulance driver. Just because you live in a liberated area, it doesn't mean you're safe. You're always exposed to airstrike and artillery, but if you need to go to a big hospital, chances are you need to go to a military-controlled town. And her son was a volunteer ambulance driver, bringing people from the liberated area to the hospital in the military-controlled area. And it's difficult to make a living in the liberated area, so sometimes he would buy fish paste from the military-controlled town. I'm going to be careful about where the locations and stuff. And then resell the fish paste in the liberated area. And so one day he takes a patient this was only a few months ago, to the town, buys fish paste, and then drives it back and is stopped at a military checkpoint. And they look around his ambulance, they see the fish paste, and this guy actually wasn't a resistance fighter, but they take him to a military base and then they torture him to death for having fish paste in his ambulance. And so a few months later, we meet his mum, and again, she's incredibly generous to even talk to us about this experience, and she also is breaking down, recalling it, because she didn't know what had happened until about 17 days later, when they said, hey, you should come. They didn't let her take the body. Come see the body, as if that was some kind of generous gesture that they were making. But somebody had taken photos of this young man's body anyway, and they'd spread on Facebook. So before she actually saw his face in person after he was killed, people told her, because they'd seen photos of him on Facebook, and he was tortured. There was signs of torture on his body, but the soldiers said, oh no, he killed himself. And then they let her see the face, and then they burned his body. And by the way, her younger son was hiding in a monastery because of the conscription, and her older son was disabled and needed full-time care, which she was given, and she didn't. And her husband had passed away a long time ago. So the volunteer ambulance driver, through reselling the fish paste, was supporting her as well. This is, by the way, and the reason why I don't name her or the places is because she might need to go to that hospital one day. You never know, right? This is one small, terribly tragic, but by no means uncommon story from these areas. Everybody has their own terrible tragedy, which is being caused by the military.
Another piece of color I want to ask about from the communities you've been in, you've referenced this in some side stories, but just want to give it its due attention, and that's the presence of women. And there are women fighters, there are women leaders. You've referenced there are young women that are not going to school as they should be, but going into combat. This is another sign of the full-scale revolution that we see Burmese society undergoing. But I just want to give you a chance to comment on what you've seen of shifting gender roles, of women empowerment, of gender equality, or the opposite of it, if you've also come across that. How your experience has been in what you've encountered with that.
Overall, there's definitely positive progress and shifts towards more empowerment and liberation for women in Myanmar society, in my own small experiences that I've seen. In Karenni State, I went to visit an all-female unit who were patrolling around the front line. And some of them had been on sniper duties. The men were expected to do more combat, and sometimes on patrol they would still be joined by a male or two male fighters as well. They said that they'd also experienced some harassment among the male resistance fighters making comments, but they said overall it was becoming better and a good step forward. The women that I've encountered in the resistance usually carry out medic duties. Some of them do engage in active combat, but to a lesser extent to the males. Sometimes that might be because they choose to go for medic duties or for another role which is slightly behind the front line. Others are very keen to fight, and they really want to really want to take out the military, you know. So you can't really stop. I mean, the men can't really stop women like that when they want to be trained and they want to take them out. And it's a huge asset, right, for the resistance as well. So yeah, that was in Karenni State. I've seen women in leadership roles on the ground, like that NLDMP that I mentioned in Tanimthari region as well. And you know, there's a lot of old taboos in Myanmar, especially like if a woman is, okay, here's one, I might get this incorrect, you will know better than I will, I think. But if you are hanging laundry, dry washing on the line, you can't put the men's clothes next to the women's clothes. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So I was with a female photographer in a PDF camp, and we were washing our clothes, and I told the female photographer, oh, hang on a sec, let me go check if it's okay that you can put your clothes up on the line next to the boys' clothes, right? Which sounds bad, but I'm like, hey, we should be sensitive and let's be careful. Yeah. So I go to the PDF and I say, oh, do you mind if the photographer puts the clothes there? And he said, this is the future. You're in a PDF area. None of that stuff matters anymore now. This is the future Myanmar. Wow. And yeah, she was allowed to, you know. So we are seeing like shifts like that which are happening as well.
That's extraordinary. And I want to move next to a really fascinating topic that we have not referenced so far, and that is a developing story. So this might develop further before this episode comes out, and that's the presence of foreign fighters and how you've been tracking that.
Yeah, so in every major conflict where there are kind of clear actors, it's expected that foreigners will come to fight, like there has been in Ukraine and Syria, and even, I don't know, going back to the Spanish Civil War and way before that. There's a huge history with it. So it surprised me that it wasn't prevalent in Myanmar. And so I've been keeping track of that for like maybe a year and a half. There have been individual foreigners who have gone into the jungles to mostly train resistance in forces since the coup, very early on, especially around eastern Myanmar. But they've been doing that since the 90s and the 80s, probably the 70s, and that's kind of well documented. There seems to be an uptick in foreign fighter activity recently in western and eastern Myanmar. In Chin State, there are at the moment two foreigners who we can discuss, a UK and US citizen, who are fighting with alongside the PDF Zoland. There's probably other foreigners out there, and there's also been Chin Americans who have returned from America to fight for the resistance. I can't go into too much detail about some of the other cases for various reasons, but in the east of Myanmar, there is a new initiative to form a foreign fighter legion. It'll be initially a small group encompassing the US, UK, Canadian and Australian militaries. I should make very clear though, not government. The governments have no say over this. They're individuals in an individual capacity who are veterans of these militaries deciding to help out. And as far as I'm aware so far, there's not a mercenary aspect to it. It's more just experienced soldiers who want to participate in the combat and train the resistance forces after learning about the story where demonstrators were using slingshots and then buying guns and then standing up to this junta, and they're inspired by that. There's going to be different cases everywhere though. So that's currently taking place in the east, but that's kind of a developing story, so that's why I don't want to say too much about that. But there has been a ex-British military soldier who's already been out there, who I've spent 3 days with recently talking about things. So it's definitely one to watch. And by the time this comes out, perhaps more will become clear from that. But let me just tell you quickly about before this development of more legitimate foreign fighters were coming out. And we're living in times where there's been big wars from Afghanistan to, against ISIS in Syria and Iraq, and then more recently Ukraine. So all of these people have been involved in those kind of wars, right? So there's an element where they're seeing where the next big thing is as well, especially if they're used to that adrenaline and combat. I think it's probably difficult to just do a normal civilian life after that. There's been some very dodgy efforts, I would say, that I've encountered. One is there was a splinter group in eastern Myanmar, not in Karenni state, where I discovered there was a foreign fighter who had left just before I had arrived at the camp. He didn't leave because of me, but he just happened to be there. And I got in touch with him, and he had some weird anti-Semitic profile picture, and I was like, what is going on? So I tried to interview him, and he was very terse. And then the next time I looked, he had a swastika on his profile picture, and I was like, oh boy, what is going on? So I tried again, and then he stopped talking to me. And if he listens to this, he'll probably block me forever. But I will continue to look into that. There was another crazy thing where a group in Florida, run by a guy who couldn't make it into the American military and had volunteered with the kids, he'd set up this military camp in Florida to train people who wanted to fight in various wars like Ukraine, and he would charge them maybe $1,000 for a 1-week course. And he was making TikTok videos, fancy, snappy, join the PDF with some 60s rock music in the background. And so I saw one of these TikTok or Instagram videos, and I contacted him, and he seemed very keen on the publicity. And so I interviewed him twice, talking over different things and getting to know his background a bit, and it seemed a bit fishy. And then I said, oh, can I talk to one of these guys you will send out? And he said, yeah. So he puts me in touch with this young guy. I better not name anybody, but he was 22, also couldn't make it into the American military. And so he told me that he wants to fight for democracy in Myanmar. And neither of them seem to have a very deep knowledge about what's going on, but I mean, that's understandable. Myanmar's a complicated place. And they said that they were going to send out like this foreign fighter unit to I won't get into the details, but to a part of Myanmar. And I was thinking, these guys have no combat experience. They're in their early 20s, and they're going to go out and meet these young kids in Myanmar who have already had like 3 years of gritty fighting. And what are they going to do, right? They're going to be a liability. Are they going to tell them, the Myanmar guys, what to do on the ground? That's crazy, right? It turned out, actually, I got in touch with one of the PDF members who was talking with these Florida guys, and the PDF guy said that this outfit had promised experienced, grizzled US veterans to send out into the combat. It wasn't the case. It was guys in their early 20s who couldn't get into the American military and had paid $1,000 for a 7-day combat course. So it was a total recipe for disaster. Fortunately, it didn't happen. There was some fallout between the two sides, but we have to be careful about things like that, right? We have to try and keep an eye on it.
Yeah.
Now it seems there's some more serious efforts. And what do you think about that? Do you think it would be a good thing for foreigners to fight alongside the resistance, given that they've come this far, right? The resistance without barely no international help.
Yeah.
You've seen the progress and the evolution of the revolution, and it's so crazy that they've been able to do this all by themselves and are now getting the junta on the back foot without any help from foreigners. Yeah. But now the junta's sliding, the foreigners are coming more and more. What do you think are the consequences of that for Myanmar?
Yeah, it's a question. I'm just laughing as you say that because it kind of reminds me like when your partner finishes cleaning the house or when they're in the last little bit of it and you walk in and say like, anything I can help you with? It's clear that you've come just at the right time. If anything, I would say that I am surprised, verging on shocked that it's gone this long without more of this developing. And I'm not a conspiracy theorist in the sense of thinking that this has been happening in some form that we just haven't heard on because of with the way that social media and journalism and everything operates. I just don't think that really big stories could be totally under wraps without getting some whiffs of them. And whether one is coming with a concern of democracy and human rights and wanting to fight the good fight, like in the Spanish Civil War, which my grandfather also wanted to go and fight, and it was back in the day of that conflict, or whether it's people just wanting to look for the next conflict and have an adventure or be in a combat zone. I would say that I'm surprised that we haven't seen more of this. It's a natural fit, and so it is interesting that either maybe it's happened in some form that's just been deeply under wraps, or even people like us that I think are pretty inside with the kind of things that we hear and know, even when we don't report on them. That maybe it went far under the radar, or maybe it was maybe you just chalk this up to Myanmar, just another example of Myanmar being in the basket of really, off the, just kind of forgotten, as it's been. They called it as, the World War II and the Burma Front was known as the Forgotten Front, and so it just that continuing on today, even though it kind of staggers the mind that something of this nature would not attract those kinds of participants in some form coming over. But to get to answering your question, is it a good thing or not? I also have to be very careful that it was not looking like it was attached to something larger than it was. And as we also know about the complexity, just the complexity of the situation is so absolutely mind-boggling that it's difficult to imagine many foreigners really knowing the ropes enough and hopefully being humble enough to have any sense of all the different groups that are there, ethnic and fighters and everything else. So I think it's one of those. I think to answer your question is one of those usual answer you give with Myanmar questions of it's complicated. That it could go any number of ways. But I tend to, in some ways, you've kind of answered the question yourself by what you embedded into the very question that they've come this far on their own. And one of the things that I would say to that several guests on this podcast that have come before have, in looking at everything that the Burmese people have done themselves, have made the comment that, which I think really stands in my mind and be one of the harness their voice in answering this question. This comment that because they have led the revolution by themselves for this long, when they've been counted out and even worked against by not just the neighboring countries, but even the freaking UN, they're not doing them any favors. If they're really moving towards achieving this victory, the victory is all their own. They don't owe anyone anything. They get to, by virtue of being able to defeat this cancer in their society, and doing it without having required the help and the dependence of any other country where, that would come with certain kind of conditions and strings attached. They have earned the right up to this point to be able to continue this journey and hopefully bring the solidarity among the extraordinary complex circumstances of different groups to try to forge their new reality in their own way, which hopefully will be harmonious and inclusive of all the groups that are there. And so I do think there's something to be said about the independence of writing their own story and hopefully continuing to go on this road of immense challenges that are ahead, and to be able to continue to harness their own spirit and their own vision and what they're trying to create, and asking, and really what I would like to see, this probably gets to the core of my answer, is asking for the help that they need and hopefully getting it, because so little of the time they've actually gotten anything that they've asked for from the outside community. But in a perfect world, I'd like to see them asking for, whether it's anything from economic policy to civil society to infrastructure they need to set up, to whatever else, that hopefully it could be a position where they're able to articulate what specifically they need and articulate it to the right group that will come in without any of those other strings attached, and just help them to give trainings that are centered in local context and not copy and paste from some other training manual, and give them the tools to be able to construct that themselves. Because anyone who knows anything about Myanmar knows that if you spend any ounce of time trying to teach a skill or a practice effectively, that's immediately in front of your eyes, implemented and used with a gratitude and a hunger of wanting to learn that you don't see in other places. And so I think whether you're talking foreign fighters that are coming and doing a specialized skill or training and to the right group, or whether it's something larger, I think to be able to articulate and ask for it and then get something applicable to the future they want to build, and the key thing here is that they own it, that they're able to take that skill is not behind a firewall of a so-called expert who is going to be the one directing and some authority, but is shared openly and generously, so that they can then take that skill and use it in the way that they know their country and people best. That's the work I was doing in Myanmar when I was a trainer at the American Center, and the kind of, in any capacity that work is being done, that's something that I wholeheartedly support. And, towards those ends as well, I know now I'm the guest and you're asking the question and I'm going off in these other directions, but that's where I would also like to go in podcast training, and to be able to develop I think this is a very interesting medium of the kind of discussions that are able to have, and in this space. And I know there are Burmese and ethnic podcasts that are cropping up, but I'm a big fan of being able to help provide those trainings and those skills and those perspectives so that they can run with it. Because once they have those skills, we just step out of the way, and they're able to, and again, whether it's podcast training or whatever else, they're able to take those skills and then use them to build and forge the kind of community and journey they want to continue to be on.
Yeah, definitely. It's support without interference that's needed, and I think that it's unbelievable how far they've come without that kind of foreign help or interference. And it's in the long term is better. Unfortunately, the sad and predictable thing is that these foreigners who are coming out in an individual capacity, again, I don't have like a judgment on them. I think if they want to help the resistance, then that, you know, there's a lot of good to that. But the way our world works, there'll be a lot more media attention on Myanmar if a foreign fighter unit is formed, which could be good for Myanmar as well.
Yeah.
You know, it's a war zone. Foreigners might die out there too. There's already foreigners who have been injured in Myanmar. It's not well publicized, but there's journalists and also there's foreign fighters who have been badly hit in Myanmar and who have been, as far as I'm aware, no one's been killed yet, but have been able to be evacuated out of there. So it'll be a matter of time. But my thing was, okay, it's kind of a juicy story, right? A foreign fighter or foreign fighters going to Myanmar. It's a juicy story. It's a one-off story, perhaps. Is it worth me actually like add into that sensationalism of it? Or is it actually the beginning of a pattern? Because these guys who have shared combat experience in Ukraine or in Syria, or perhaps even in Afghanistan, they're going to share with their networks, okay, we've done 8 weeks on the ground in Myanmar and here's what it's like. And then perhaps there'll be more and more foreigners will come. And in that sense, it's not so sensational anymore. Then it becomes an actual pattern, which is definitely worth reporting on. So I've decided to, well, at the moment, I haven't done anything about it, but I probably will do soon and try to keep track of it. But yeah, those guys in Florida, I'll just add, they even made their own Myanmar Foreign Legion combat uniform with their own little logos to try to sell to people on Instagram and TikTok. So it was kind of a scam, you know. It was like, it was about merch. They're just trying to push merch. On the other side, there's also foreigners who have been seen with helping the junta. White guys, you know, from Russia. There's been reports. I've spoken to people who have been on the front line and have said, oh, one of my guys saw this white guy in his scope when he was like, you know, on sniper duties or on the base, and he thinks that he's like a Russian trainer. Now that the Myanmar military is taken seriously and developing more combat drone units, there's been reports that Russian trainers are in Myanmar helping the Myanmar military with combat drones. So you know, there's activity on both sides when it comes to foreigners as well.
I have just one more question on my side, and then I know there's some things you want to share at the end of this, and thank you again so much for your generous time in this. And that's, I want to circle back to something that you had we referenced at the beginning about the concept of objective reporting and your pushback against what it means to be objective when you're facing just a real tyrannical, oppressive, evil, I think we could use the word, regime. And yet at the same time, there's also when you're working with resistance fighters, everything's not always so peachy, and that there can be stories that need to be reported on. And this becomes a challenge in knowing how to do, because on one hand, you never, in this kind of situation, you never want to do a both sidesism. You never want to be like, well, this is happening on this side, this is happening on that side. So anything that's being reported of concern on the resistance side immediately falls into that concern area that this is trending towards both sidism, but then on the other hand, you as a journalist and someone being objective, you also want to have the right and the creative control to be able to share what you're seeing and hearing and finding objectively, and that's balanced with a people that have been oppressed and traumatized for all of these years, as we've described in this vivid detail of what the civilian population has gone through. 3 million, I think, is the number of IDPs that are there right now, and just the unspeakable trauma and horror that we can go on and on and on with, that have a desire to want to hear good news, that they don't want to hear about some problem or the other that's happening on the resistance side. They just want this military uprooted. And so how do you balance all of these countervailing forces in trying to figure out how you can, when you have, when there's something on the resistance side that is of a concern, you think is important to know about, and yet you have this fear of both sidesism and also the desire for good news and probably the sympathy with those who are justifiably feeling that way. How do you figure out what to report and how to report it when it falls in that area?
Yeah, I think you have to rely on what you consider is newsworthy or not, almost like first. That should be a priority. And sometimes when you're so absorbed into the dynamics of what's happening in Myanmar, and you can't see the wood from the trees, and it's easy to think, oh, this is definitely a story, or this isn't a story. But you have to kind of force yourself to zoom out and think, okay, what is and isn't a story, and also like, what's my role, because there are things that you can pursue and you see, and which as a journalist you probably should pursue, and then suddenly there's a little voice. Oh, I mean, I'll be totally honest, there's been times where I've considered doing a story, and then there's been a voice saying, oh, perhaps this will be bad though for the revolution, right? And the greater good is overcoming the Myanmar hunter. But you have to kind of stop yourself when you start thinking things like that and actually think, what's my role in this? Am I an activist? Am I a fighter? No, I'm none of those things. And I believe that if you just try to report what's newsworthy and in front of you, then those things can just be put to bed because you're just doing your role there. But I would say that from the journalist's perspective, because now more journalists are going out to Myanmar, and as we've seen, some resistance groups have announced some like media guidelines and restrictions, which is normal for governments to do in that respect. So we shouldn't just panic there and think, oh my God, there's a media crackdown. But the journalist should understand what is at stake for the armed groups and the civilians, as you said. People are throwing everything on the line to rid their country of a terrible dictatorship. If the journalist is worried about conditions, just don't bother going in the first place, because it will be mentally and physically challenging, and you might be severely injured or die. So journalists should do their homework and be prepared and understand that you're entering a very complicated picture. So do as much research as you can for that, so you don't make some silly faux pas, or you don't cause problems for yourself that you could have avoided. But also the resistance should understand what journalism is. Journalism is not a mouthpiece for the PDF. It's not a mouthpiece for the EAOs or the EROs or whoever. It's an independent take on what is happening, and sometimes that means interviewing people who the hosting party, for instance, may dislike. So there needs to be understandings, I think, on both sides about what's going on. As time goes on, I think we'll see more coverage from PDF areas, and so that will present some problems in terms of the relationship between the PDF, the resistance, and the media. So Joe, I wanted to give a voice to a PDF commander who I have a lot of respect for. He's been around for a long time fighting the military, and he always has like very unique insights and makes me think about things in a different way. So he's got some concerns about what's happening on the ground at the moment, and he's on the ground. I won't say his name and I won't say where he is, other than I can say Eastern Myanmar. And overall, when you talk to people like this on the ground, there's this question that you want to ask, right? Which you probably ask a lot of people. Is the military going to collapse? Is the resistance going to win? It's like the most straightforward question, because we all want to know. We all want reassurances that the resistance will win. I have good news. He thinks that the resistance will win, or I perhaps should say, he thinks that the military will collapse. He said that he's still very confident. There's, in his quote, no way that the military can turn the tables now on what's happening. But that doesn't mean that the resistance doesn't need strong leadership. His big point is that strong leadership that can understand when it's not performing tasks and to carry out their responsibilities. He says it's more important than ever, and it's more needed in Myanmar now. And every aspect of what's happening should be utilized towards the strengths of the resistance. For instance, if the resistance takes in a lot of POWs, or if they take in defectors, their knowledge of the military should be utilized for the gains of the resistance. So it's good that he says that that the resistance will likely still overcome, and he's a very realistic guy. So on the ground a lot. So to hear it from him should give us, a bit of a boost in confidence as well. But he doesn't make any qualms about the challenges that the resistance are going through. There's a lot more I could go into, but I have to be careful about what to say and what not to say, to make sure that I don't kind of break his trust here as well. One really important thing that he finished on is, although this challenge of overcoming the military is monumental for the resistance right now, and so many people are suffering and dying to gain democracy for Myanmar, huge challenges lie on the horizon. According to this commander, the biggest challenge is going to be the reintroduction of the fighters and people who have been deeply traumatized by the current conflict in the future. He said that there will be severe PTSD, which could become a serious and overwhelming issue to deal with for Myanmar, where, in his words, expression of feeling and emotion could be translated as taboos, and it has only minimal knowledge to deal with.
Wow.
So it's, in his eyes, this is one of the most crucial things, is that when these youths are fighting the military and in environments where there's been, in some cases, a lack of discipline, in his words, and they've encountered various hardships and they've probably done things which no human should have to do. These people will need to be reintroduced to society, and they would need education and training and a chance to get the opportunities that they missed out because of the sacrifices they've made to face the military in an incredibly brave way.
Yeah.
So to finish with his words, he said, "We need to address these issues urgently and initiate programs to manage these adverse impacts for the youths." So I think that as foreigners, we should see that as perhaps ways that we can help Myanmar in the future, is by helping in any small way we can with a healing process and the reintroduction process for all of these young people who have sacrificed their lives and opportunities for the better of the country.
That's extraordinary. That's quite a thing to end on, is that reality. It's something that's come up in previous interviews, but to hear a PDF commander who is not just focused on the upcoming victory, but also aware of the devastation that lies ahead of a country that has just, I just don't even know how we conceptualize or understand the depth of trauma that has been hoisted upon, the people, and all of the stories, the anecdotes you've heard, anecdotes I've heard, that of people that were living quote unquote normal lives before 2021, that an absolute accepting an abnormal, surreal situation, that you just think about your personal memory of those first 2 months after the coup that you were so fortunate to have a plane out of. Even those 2 months are going to be things you probably remember and process the rest of your life. And you imagine, and that's in the city, that's not even in the countryside, where it's a whole other story, not the ethnic areas. And just to hold that thought of the healing that needs to take place, and the extraordinary mental counseling and therapy of some kind or another that has to go on. It's a heavy thought, and I really thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you very much for your time today and for having me on, and keep up the good work. But I'll just keep on trying to report on what's going on. I'll probably do fewer shorter articles in the future and focus more on longer form stuff. But I think that it's going to be a pivotal year for Myanmar. It always has been over the past few. But I think in terms of where the conflict is heading over the next year, we're going to see a lot. But the resistance, many are not taking it for granted, a victory already. And I think that's wise. Yeah. To not get complacent.
And is there anywhere where listeners can find more about you or your work, your past work, your ongoing work that you'd like to direct them to?
Yeah, they can. I sometimes tweet, not too often, but every now and then, so they can follow me on Twitter, Lorcan_Lovett. I have an online website as well where I'll post some of my work, and I think that's it for now.
I know for a lot of podcast listeners, as soon as the fundraising requests start up, you just kind of zone out or skip ahead till it's over. But I ask that if you're taking the time to listen to our full podcast, that you also take the time to consider our spiel. Some may assume that producing a 2-hour episode wouldn't take much more than the conversation itself. But so much more goes into it. In advance of the interview, our content team reviews the biography and relevant works of the upcoming guests, and we discuss the best way to use our limited time together. After the interview is completed, the raw audio file is sent to our sound engineer who shapes it into working order. A single episode can take several full days of solid production work in the studio, which is carefully coordinated with our content team to ensure smooth listening. Further edits and post-production magic bring the eventual episode into your ears, along with extensive written descriptions of each interview, which we publish on our blog and social media. Many of these steps require an outlay of funds in some way or another. We hope that each episode informs you about the ongoing crisis, and if you find it of value, we also hope that you might consider supporting our mission. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go on to support a wide range of humanitarian and media missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, refugee camps, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects, as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution to a specific activity or project you would like to support, perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause, and both websites accept credit card. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we can take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either website for specific links to these respective accounts or email us at info@betterburma.org. That's Better Burma, one word, spelled BETTERBURMA.org. If you would like to give it another way, please contact us. We also invite you to check out our range of handicrafts that are sourced from vulnerable artisan communities across Myanmar, available at alokacrafts.com. Any purchase will not only support these artisan communities, but also our nonprofit's wider mission. That's Aloka Crafts, spelled ALOKACRAFTS, one word, alokacrafts.com. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.
Yeah, you're